Hello everyone! One of the questions that gets asked quite a bit by Star Wars fans is how involved George Lucas was in the expanded universe. There's a lot of quotes out there from George and the people around him, and frankly, I'm not here to open that Pandora's box again, because there's conflicting information. What I want instead is to focus on George Lucas's involvement in a specific part of the expanded universe, the Tales of the Jedi comics. What you'll see is that overall, the information we have on his involvement in the Tales of the Jedi is by and large consistent. Before I delve into it, quick backstory. Tales of the Jedi was a comic series of 35 issues that ran from October 1993 to November 1998. It's comprised of 8 story arcs that detail the trials and tribulations of the ancient Jedi Knights at 2 very pivotal moments in their history. This comic series paved the way for the Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, as well as the Old Republic MMORPG. It was originally conceived by Tom Veitch, who had previously written the Dark Empire comics. Later on, Veitch was joined by Kevin J. Anderson. While there were several artists that worked on the series, the 2 main artists would have been Chris Gossett, or Christian Gossett, and Dario Carrasco Jr. Chris Gossett was involved from the start and helped Veitch visualize what ancient Jedi stories set in the Old Republic would look like. So how did it all start? Well, as early as 1988, Tom Veitch had envisioned writing a comic series that centered on the ancient Jedi of the Old Republic. You know Obi-Wan's quote from A New Hope? "For 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic." That's what Veitch wanted to show, and he wanted to show it at a time before the prequels existed. So of course he needed buy-in, not only from Lucasfilm, but from George Lucas himself. He was in truly uncharted territory. So when Tom Veitch initially pitched the idea to Lucasfilm, he was met with some skepticism. They were interested in the story, but they didn't believe Star Wars had much life left in it. You have to remember that at this time, this was before the expanded universe really took off in 1991 with Heir to the Empire. In Star Wars Adventure Journal Issue 2, published May 1994, Tom Veitch, along with Chris Gossett and Dark Horse editor Dan Thorsland, were interviewed. The interview was conducted by Eileen Rosenberg, and the piece is called "Making Star Wars Comics Come Alive." In that interview, Veitch recalls members of the comics industry telling him that he was crazy and that Star Wars was dead. Well, Veitch eventually did go on to write Dark Empire, which came out in 1991 and 1992. For those of you who are familiar with it, Veitch managed to work in some of the ideas about the ancient Jedi, particularly in the endnotes that talk about a specific Jedi named Ulic Qel-Droma. So, when Dark Empire proved to be a huge commercial success, Veitch revisited the idea of writing about ancient Jedi with Lucasfilm. He wanted to call his story the Jedi Chronicles. Again, Lucasfilm was skeptical. He was told something along the lines of, "Oh, George will never go for this." Well, apparently George loved the idea, and Veitch was given free rein to explore the Star Wars universe 4,000 years before the films. In an interview conducted in April 2008 by Greyman, which you can find on Wikipedia, Veitch explains that George had a couple conditions. The first was that he couldn't call the story Jedi Chronicles because it was too similar to the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, another product of Lucasfilm at the time. The second condition was that Veitch had to get final approval from George Lucas on the comic's storyline. So, Tom changes the name of his story to The Tales of the Jedi, and off he goes. In that Adventure Journal interview, he brings us through his creative method. First, he goes back to the source and rewatches all 3 Star Wars flicks to get in the right frame of mind. His intention was to study all of the layers of detail in the movies and the way they were constructed. Second, he makes use of the role-playing game supplements from West End Games. After all, he needs to make sure his ideas fit within an already established universe, even during that early era of EU history. Third, he goes back to his endnotes from Dark Empire and decides to construct the story around a fallen ancient Jedi named Ulic Qel-Droma. Okay, so now we're at the point where we have a story. This brings us to Lucy Autry Wilson. At that time, Wilson was the director of publishing for Lucasfilm. More importantly, she was the liaison between George Lucas and the creative minds behind Tales of the Jedi. In that Adventure Journal article, Chris Gossett explains what their relationship was. He says, "We have a liaison, Lucy Wilson. She would let us know when we were stepping out of bounds and when we were doing things that weren't consistent with the whole Star Wars universe. She let us know if there were inconsistencies, and she would tell us when she thought that we were doing the right thing." End quote. The article goes on to explain how it would work with George. Veach and his team created various questionnaires that would outline their intentions with regards to the story. Wilson would then give these questionnaires to George Lucas, who would either approve or disapprove of the content. Here's what Veach had to say about it. These questionnaires were reviewed by George because he wants to make sure if you're going to tell about the ancient Jedi, he wants to have input on it. We have to write very carefully detailed questionnaires and list the ideas we want to use." End quote. Let me say this one more time. George Lucas wanted input on the stories that would be told regarding the ancient Jedi of the Old Republic. In this same interview from the Adventure Journal, Dan Thorsland describes that Lucasfilm was very exacting in their standards. In retrospect, he believes the policy was a good one, as it helped enhance the quality of the Tales of the Jedi storylines. Here's an actual example of how it played out. Veach comes up with this concept of Jedi battle meditation, which has since become a mainstay in the expanded universe. He runs it by George through Lucy, and George approves the idea. Now Veach gets to portray the new Jedi power through Nomi Sunrider. Veach tells us that he got quite a bit of input on Nomi Sunrider from Lucy Wilson. Here's another actual example. Veach wants to create an alien Jedi, while George tells Lucy, who tells Tom, that there were a lot of alien Jedi in the Old Republic, something we wouldn't really see on the screen until the prequels. Now Tom has this information, and he creates Twi'lek Jedi taught Donita. Eventually, after a few of the Tales story arcs, Kevin J. Anderson and Tom Veach realize that there's an opportunity for collaboration. At the time, Anderson was writing his Jedi Academy trilogy. This trilogy included the spirit of a long-dead Sith Lord named Exar Kun. At a certain point, both of them realized that this character would fit well within the existing Tales of the Jedi storylines. Veach recalls that both he and Lucasfilm, presumably Lucy Wilson, were unsure about what George Lucas would think about all this. Making stories about ancient Jedi is one thing, but portraying the Sith was not something they had yet done. You have to remember, the word Sith was known in the expanded universe and mentioned in the movie novelizations, but it had never been uttered on screen until The Phantom Menace came out in 1999, after the Tales of the Jedi concluded its final arc. So they really were breaking new ground here, and again, to their surprise, George Lucas loved the idea of them talking about the ancient Sith. Star Wars Insider magazine did a Tales of the Jedi retrospective in issues 150, 151, and 153, where you can find much of this information. Tom Veach also confirmed that George loved the idea of them exploring the history of the Sith in his 2008 interview with Greyman. Eventually, Veach left Tales of the Jedi. Without getting too much into the reasons, Veach would later say in that 2008 interview that as Star Wars once again became a cultural phenomenon, he felt his freedom begin to slip away, and so it was time to do other things. I mean, this makes sense. The expanded universe was coming into its own, and Lucasfilm had an increasingly difficult job of keeping it not only consistent with itself, but also with George's vision. After Tom Veach departed, Kevin J. Anderson took over as writer on the series, and Dario Carrasco Jr. took over as lead artist. In an interview conducted in 2008, also by Greyman, Anderson explains that the process with George and Lucasfilm did not change. When they were developing the history of the Sith for the Golden Age of the Sith, Anderson and Carrasco worked closely with Lucasfilm on the storyline. Again, they would submit specific questions about the ancient Sith to George Lucas, and he would personally answer, providing them with a fair amount of material for use in their stories. Here's another actual example. Lucasfilm restricted Carrasco from making any direct copy of a human historical setting when portraying the ancient Sith Empire and the Ancient Republic. Luckily, Carrasco had a degree in architecture, and he was skillfully able to blend old world civilizations such as Mesopotamia, feudal Japan, ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt to create something truly unique and visually appealing. He was told by Lucasfilm that if the influence taken from our world can be improved upon, as long as the design was alien-looking in structure, it would pass muster. For instance, he drew a Sith sarcophagus that was rejected by Lucasfilm as looking too much like an ancient Egyptian coffin. So he went back to the drawing board, quite literally, and made it look more exotic. In episode 4 of my podcast, Legends of the Jedi, which I published back in the summer of 2021, I talked about the letters column from The Fall of the Sith Empire issue 1. A fan wrote into the Jedi journals and he complained about the backstory of the Sith. He was upset with how they chose to portray the Sith in the Tales of the Jedi comics. Well, interestingly enough, Kevin J. Anderson answered, and what he said is very instructive. I'll throw it up for you to take a look at for yourself. I took a picture of this the other day and shared it with a few people. I understand it's been making the rounds on Twitter, which is good to see. People should know about this. Even though this information is nothing new, it's been there on the printed page for over 20 years. So here's how Anderson responds to the fan. Sorry you don't like the framework for the Sith and the Dark Jedi, but that background came directly to us from George Lucas. We're following his guidelines and building a story within the parameters he himself laid down. It may not match with your own ideas, but this is George's universe and he gets to establish the rules. We just try to tell the best story we can within them. So there you have it. But to be clear, what George Lucas did not do is hand Kevin J. Anderson or Tom Veitch a completed story treatment. Anderson says in the 2008 interview that Lucasfilm rarely handed them characters or stories. On the contrary, Lucasfilm was extremely flexible with these comics and allowed pretty much free reign as long as they stayed true to the spirit of Star Wars. And I will say, if you've ever read the Tales of the Jedi, then you'll know it's something these comics do exceedingly well. They don't feature Luke, Leia, Han Solo, or Chewbacca. We don't see Darth Vader, but they feel like Star Wars. They look like Star Wars. And because of that, they're a significant achievement within the expanded universe. The next time someone tells you George Lucas wasn't involved or didn't care about the expanded universe, just show them this video. Go look at the Adventure Journal interview or any of the retrospectives in Star Wars Insider. Go read through the 2 interviews with Greyman in 2008. George cared about his creation. He cared about the stories that were being told within his universe, and like Anderson tells us, he provided the basic framework for those histories. So, to answer the question I posed at the beginning of this video, what was George's involvement in the Tales of the Jedi? Well, I would classify it as an active involvement. Without George's input, this series doesn't get made. And without his input, I would venture to say it wouldn't really feel like Star Wars in the way that it does. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you for tuning in. Revanchist out.